afternoon, everyone. I'm I'm the Executive Director of the Bar Harbor Historical Society, and I want to welcome you to our program this afternoon with David Schildkret on the history of music in Bar Harbor. And before I introduce David, I want to remind us that we are in the homeland of Wabanaki peoples. We extend our respect and gratitude to Wabanaki peoples and their ancestors, and we recognize their rich histories, living cultures, artistic traditions, including music. I also want to let you know that if you are not a member of the museum, please consider joining. Benefits include free admission to the museum, advance notice of programs, special members-only programs, and other benefits as well. And please check our website and our Facebook page for our upcoming programs. Our next program will be a walk to look at the ruins on Bar Island with Therese Miller on July 17th. And this is a members-only program. Space is very limited, so sign up early. David Schildkret is Professor of Music and Co-Director of Choral Activities at Arizona State Choral Activities, at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. And since 2000, he has conducted the annual concerts at the Mount Desert Summer Chorale. This summer, he will lead the chorale in Mozart's Requiem, honoring those who we have lost to COVID-19. So now, silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming David Schildkret.
I've gotten old and my knees don't work as well anymore, so if you'll forgive me, I'll sit down, and that will also mean that you'll have an unobstructed view of the screen, because among the things that's happened to me is I've gotten wider and I can block that screen. I love that you had a land acknowledgement. I had put one in mine, and I kind of wanted to say that out loud because my students have taught me to do that. And I had to go back and revise this talk because 10 years ago when I first did it, there was not a single mention of indigenous people. So we grow and we learn. If you go to the Ledge Lawn Cemetery over there on Cromwell Harbor Road, be nice if this behaves, just to the left of the entrance, you see these two tombstones. And these are the graves of Walter Damrosch on the left and his wife Margaret, who was the daughter of the famous 19th century Maine politician James G. Blaine. Walter Damrosch was one of America's most celebrated musicians. He was a household name. In addition to his prominence as a New York conductor, pianist, and composer, Damrosch served as the music advisor to NBC Radio. And it was in this capacity that he became best known. He created and hosted the enormously popular NBC Music Appreciation Hour from 1928 to 1942. Accompanying the program were student notebooks and instruction manuals for teachers. NBC estimated that the program had 5 million listeners each week. In a sense, Damrosch was sort of the Leonard Bernstein of his time. We all grew up watching Leonard Bernstein giving young people's concerts. This was the same sort of thing. Damrosch began to come to Mount Desert Island around 1890 when he married Margaret Blaine. He quickly became a celebrity in the Bar Harbor summer colony, and his musical friends flocked to join him here. Now, just a short distance up the Cromwell Harbor Road from where the Damrosches are buried stands a marker in what looks like an empty field. This is one of the wonderful Museum in the Streets displays, and it gives information about one of the most impressive buildings in Bar Harbor in the first half of the 20th century, the Building of Arts. Now that picture's upstairs too, and it shows President Taft playing golf on the Kibo golf course. I don't know what hole that is, but there's the fourth hole, okay, and a sand trap right across from where this is. So if you've ever played that golf course, you just look up the hill, that's where the Building of Arts was. There's not much left of it today, just the foundations. That's probably the front. That's the left-hand side. And that's the back, looking toward the front. So Yes, I went on posted ground. I'm probably guilty of a crime here. Now, when I first did this about 10 years ago, it was a lot harder to find this because that was a really overgrown hill. And so you had to bury around and find bits of the foundations that even at that time still had some of the stones still on top of the foundations. That's what it looked like about 10 years ago. That's all that remains of the once elegant building of arts. As you can see, it was a magnificent building modeled on a Greco-Roman temple, built by the summer colony, and it opened in 1907. It could seat something like 350 audience members. In its heyday, the building of arts was a glittering temple, attracting the cream of society to performances ranging from recitals by the most famous international musicians of the day to theatricals and musicales put on by the summer residents, usually to benefit a local organization. Just the other side of this wall, there's another picture of the building of arts with cars in front of it. Terrific piano there from the 19th century. The stuff all over this house is tremendous. There's a couple of harmoniums. You just have a great time here. Well, we don't have written records. Sorry, I turned the page too soon. All right. This is the story of how Mount Desert Island grew to become a center of musical culture in the Western European tradition, a musical culture that survives to this day, though in somewhat different form. It's a story in which Walter Damrosch and the Building of Arts played a central role, along with many others. Now, long before Samuel Champlain described it as Mount Desert, there were various names for this island, including Passamcook and Pematik. It was already a place for summer visitors to gather the plentiful seafood. When Europeans came, there were members of the Wabanaki nation on the island. We don't have written records of the music that the various tribes that made up the Wabanaki nation played, but we can conjecture that it was similar to the ritual music we hear today. So I have a brief example. I'm afraid you're going to have to be really quiet because it's just coming out of the computer. But here's a brief example of a Passamaquoddy round dance, and I believe the lyrics are about the strength of women. The story of European music on Mount Desert Island begins in the 18th century, long before rusticators, tourists, and other summer visitors began to make it a destination. The life of the first white settlers here must have been rough, yet music still played a central role. At the MDI Historical Society collection is a large hymn book, probably the earliest musical item from the area that survives, unless y'all have something older. But at least 10 years ago, that was the oldest thing we knew about. It has an inscription card along with it, and it's signed by George J. Joey, you can see at the top there, 1931. And he says, this is a very old book. You see where it's underlined here at the bottom? Probably nearly back to the time of General Greene of Revolutionary fame, as John Green Joy was among the first of the earlier joys of the settlement at Ellsworth. The book is a large, oblong volume containing all of the psalms and hymns of the English hymn writer Isaac Watts. It gives both the words and the music, which is somewhat unusual in early hymnals. Usually they just gave the words. And this is a book clearly designed for choral singing. And keep it in mind, because you'll see later a picture of people holding these big books. Here's another page from the book. Unfortunately, this copy is missing the first 20 pages or so, and so there's no information that would tell us when the book was published. It's a little aggravating, I have to say. I've tried to track it down with only limited success. What I can say is that collections like this were published in New York in 1761. That's the year Soamesville was founded. In Boston in 1767 and 1773, and in Philadelphia in 1778. So it's probably one of those. I've not been able to see any examples of those prints to determine if this is the same as any of those, but I would bet that this is one of the Boston prints from 1767 or 1773. That would make the most sense. So that puts it right around the time that Soamesville was founded. Containing, as it does, the tunes as well as the words, this particular print is of special interest because many of the tunes are unfamiliar to us today. So this is a bit of a treasure trove. Maybe one of my retirement projects will be to transcribe some of these melodies. It would be great to hear them. As was typical of such books in the 18th and 19th centuries, the volume begins with instructional material. This page, with its necessary rules to be observed in vocal music, you might be able to see that just at the top, is among my favorites. It tells you how to sing. So it includes such choice pieces of advice as, be exactly in tune, for it is not worthwhile to attempt singing without a perfect intonation. We're encouraged to sing tastefully, lest we descend to dissonant bawling. And we're told that acute sounds should never be so forced as to render them similar to shrieks. It's all very good advice. Much of what I say in choir rehearsals even now. So, that music and good singing were important to the growing community on Mount Desert Island is demonstrated by the existence of an agreement dating from 1845 and preserved at the MDI Historical Society. This is signed by 26 members of the community and says at the top there, we, the undersigned, being desirous of having a singing school for the purpose of improving our singing, do agree to pay the sums set against our names. These range from $1 to $3, totaling $41, and the money was used to employ a singing teacher. Really, as much as anything, this would have been like a community choir or a hymn singing group. If you know like shape note groups, this is the origin of that type of singing. Among the names on the list are many that are familiar today. There's 8 members of the Soames family there, including Sarah Soames. There she is at the top arrow. One of 2 women listed, the other is down below there, Miss S.M. Harper. There are 3 Kittredges on the list, and there's the names of Haynes and Jordan. There were singing groups in various places on the island, including quartets that sang at funerals. The singing school of 1871, so this was a tradition that continued, was concluded with a concert given by a group of 53 singers led by J.H. Butler. And I don't have a visual of that, but here's a similar group in 1880 in New Hampshire. And again, notice those big books they're holding. That's the size of the book over there at the MDI Historical Society. The program in 1871 included Lift Thine Eyes from Mendelssohn's Elijah, and concluded with the Gloria from the so-called 12th Mass of Mozart, which we now know to be a 19th century forgery. The performance was accompanied by organ and a small orchestra, and the singing was, quote, sustained firmly and steadily throughout, according to an enthusiastic review in the Ellsworth American. Now, as you know, if you know anything about the history of this island and its settlement by whites and Europeans, artists took note of the place beginning around the 1840s, and that was the impetus for people to come from Boston and New York. Summer visitors began to come around the 1850s. It was difficult to get here. A trip from New York took the better part of 3 days and 2 nights and involved several different trains and boats, so there's hardly an onslaught of visitors coming to the island, no cruise ships. Thanks to the notes of Charles Tracy, who visited Mount Desert Island in 1855 with a party of 20 people, including the painter Frederick Church, we have some insight into what life was like for some of the first wealthy American visitors to come to the island. Music was so important to well-to-do families of this era that Tracy, this drives me crazy, it's amazing. Tracy had a piano brought up from New York to Mount Desert Island so that they would have it with them while they stayed here for a month. You couldn't be a month without a piano. It would probably have been a lot like the one that's just next to me here. It arrived in the afternoon of their first day in Soamesville, and that evening, Tracy noted, they had a charming time with music and books and conversation. We always worry that we're packing too much, but we have never packed a piano. Actually, I do have an electric one in storage over there, the storage locker that we have. Toward the end of their visit here, the Tracys held a ball. Tracy writes in his logbook, The invitations are for 6:30 p.m. Guests are here from Southwest Harbor, Bar Harbor, and Schooner Head, and the posse of Soamesville. The dining room was cleared and made our third saloon all gaily lighted up. A fiddler and a flute player were stationed at the end of the long room, and dancing went on there while conversation had full course in the two parlors. The whole party numbered 80 persons, including ourselves. Of course, they were all strangers to us, but we made ourselves very easy. The dance helped. The piano was always going, and we had songs and glees in abundance. Let's remember, there's no iPods. There's not even a Victrola at this point. And it's so important to remember. I try to remind my students of this. If you wanted to hear music before about 1900, there had to be somebody in the room playing it. There was no other way to do it. And it's easy to forget because it's so easy to hear music now. It's ubiquitous. Tracy goes on not only to describe the entertainments, but the dinner, which included lobster salad and duck sandwiches. Frederick Church cut the vegetables into the shapes of flowers. And there were numerous lavish desserts. And this is my favorite part. The last party to leave the party were the two Miss Roberts of Bar Harbor. They left the party at 2 o'clock in the morning and took the old road. So I think they were at the Soamesville Meeting House. You know where that is, the cross from the church. And it was a 14-mile trip to Bar Harbor. Probably, and it says they took the old road. So I'm guessing they went down something like 198, probably to the crooked road, over to something like where Route 3 is now, some such thing like that. Can you guess how long this 14-mile trip took? 2 hours. Wow. So that also we have to keep in mind, right? This drive that takes us, what, 20 minutes to get from Bar Harbor to over to Soamesville was a 2-hour trip. Now, of course, it was dark. You know, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. But the most you could do on really good roads, and I know this from having studied about Mozart, was about 25 miles an hour. Maybe 50. A day, right? Sorry, maybe 50 in a day. So what we can do in an hour would take a day if you're using horses as the means of transportation. So to get from here to Bangor, day and a half. Imagine. Well, with improved railway travel, Mount Desert, and particularly Bar Harbor, became an increasingly popular destination after the Civil War. As a result of the growing social scene, especially in the summer, there sprung up a number of dance bands. These were small groups, usually 4 or 5 local musicians, who played all kinds of functions, funerals and all kinds of things. The other highly popular musical establishment of this era was the brass band. Every town had one. And while the one in Bar Harbor didn't get going until 1898, it's one of the few that still functions. Maine boasted one of the most famous bands, that of R.B. Hall, who was born in Bodenham in 1858. Hall became a popular composer, and John Philip Sousa conducted one of his marches at the Paris Exposition in 1900. So I'm going to play you one of his marches, and while it plays, I have a montage of photos of Hall, of his band, and then of other bands around Maine. And I'll just remark, many of those other bands you'll see are on main streets of towns around, and it's unbelievable how much those places still look the same. There's a picture in here somewhere of Main Street in the 1920s, and I vow if you took the cars away, you would think it was a current photograph. It just really doesn't look any different. I love that. So here's the new colonial march. Looks like he's wearing his father's suit, doesn't he? Paul's in the middle there holding the stick. bandwagon? That's a bandwagon. It literally is. Production values in this, all the coming and going. So while the Bar Harbor Town Band may not have been organized until 1898, which is relatively late for these bands, there must have been others here earlier because there is band music preserved in the collection of the MDI Historical Society. I want to say a little bit more about the brass bands. This is really a vestige of the Civil War. And you can see they were often dressed in uniforms that looked like military uniforms, even though they were not military affiliated. So there's a couple of things that are outgrowths of the Civil War, just because of that idea of dressing up in uniforms and marching in lines. The other is football. Football was invented shortly after the Civil War, partly because they wanted to find another way for young men to become manly and so forth. And if you think about football, it's a battle, where the battle line shifts up and down the field. There's a wonderful podcast about this on from NPR, Radio Lab. It talks all about the history of football and its connections to the Civil War. But the other one is these brass bands. So there must have been something here in the 1870s, because among the bits and pieces that I found of music in the MDI Historical Society collection is a complete set of parts for this piece called By the Quiet Lake. That's appropriate enough. By a person named F.J. Keller. I could not find much about F.J. Keller. I assume it's a him, but it may not be. But you see copyright 1877, so well before the town band was formed. Because there's a complete set of parts, I was able to reconstruct the piece. And what that means is putting each part into a computer program, actually writing out a score, and then getting the computer to play the score. So here's a little bit of that reconstruction. That gives you an idea of what that was like. At the very time this piece was published, Bar Harbor was becoming a fashionable resort. In 1876, the New York Times reported that there were a score of hotels, and that compares to one diminutive tavern, the Agamont House, 10 years earlier. The hotels were the center of summertime social life, providing almost nightly dances called hops. I think we still had sock hops like in the 50s and 60s, right? One of the more fashionable hotels was the Louisbourg on Atlantic Avenue, where dances were held almost every night. The Louisbourg was only one of the fancy hotels. Others were Lynam's, the Roddick. Sorry, I misspoke there. That's Louisbourg. This is the Malvern Hotel. So Lynam's and Malvern. Here's the Roddick and the Grand Central Hotel that was torn down, and that's where the Village Green is now. This is the site of that hotel. Soon, Bar Harbor, the New York Times carried almost weekly reports in the 1880s and onward of the summer doings here in Bar Harbor. Soon, Bar Harbor began to rival Newport, Rhode Island in glamour and appeal to high society, divided between those who stayed in hotels, that was the riffraff really, and the larger family groups that stayed in summer cottages. Really, the people who stayed in the hotels were often not very well behaved, and they were rowdy, and the year-round residents grumbled about that. Not much has changed. Among the amusements for the pleasure-seeking crowd were the nearly nightly musicales at Lynam's Hotel, readings and theatricals at Roddick's, and various kinds of dances at all the hotels. Musical events and dances also took place in private homes, sometimes on a grand scale. This cottage, built by the Barney family, was designed, the New York Times reported in 1891, quote, with an especial view to entertainments, all the rooms on the lower floor being so constructed that they can open into each other and make one immense hall. This was called Vanier Bring, built for the Barney family. The same report goes on to detail a party given there for 100 people. Several members of the party sang for the guests. Mrs. Whelan had a grand contralto voice, and Miss Francesca Lunt of Boston possessed a mezzo-soprano voice with, quote, a full liquid quality. Somewhat later, music for the housewarming of one socialite's newly built cottage was provided by a little group called the Boston Symphony Orchestra, members of which would provide daily concerts at the Kibo Club in the early years of the 20th century. Imagine what was going on here. It's unbelievable. Society columns in the New York Times, by the way, you can find all this online nowadays, it's tremendous, reported a veritable parade of the rich and famous to Bar Harbor, and many of the names are still familiar to us today: Vanderbilt, Astor, Rockefeller, Roosevelt, and many, many others. Visitors and summer people included presidents, politicians, wealthy people from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and farther afield, Cincinnati and Chicago among them. In addition to tycoons and blue bloods, there was also a large contingent of artists and academics from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and other important schools. The doings in Bar Harbor were reported alongside those in Newport, and one senses that there may have been a bit of competition between the two summer colonies. So it's perhaps not so surprising that after a casino, not a gambling hall, but a social hall, was built in Newport in 1880, it wasn't long before there was talk of building one here in Bar Harbor as well. The New York Times mentions the possibility of a casino in Bar Harbor for the first time on August 30th, 1885, so 5 years after this was built. A glowing report of dances, musicales, and receptions everywhere from ships docked in the harbor, cruise ships, to hotels and private homes concludes, quote, the cottage life grows more and more distinct from that of the hotels, and another season will probably find a casino and a society not unlike that of Newport. So understand what's going on. Younger people are coming, they're taking rooms in hotels, they're single, they're by themselves, and they're a bit rowdy. And then there's the wealthier people who bring up their servants and everything else to a place like this. There are, 4 or 5 large guest rooms upstairs, so you have an unending flow of guests. And that's a very different kind of society from what's hanging out in the hotels downtown. And they want a place to gather, so maybe the casino would be it. In the years between 1890 and 1900, various schemes for building a casino were reported in the New York Times. One involved a partnership among 3 clubs for a building near the present-day Agamemnon Park. Various plans were offered for erecting a casino at the corner of Main and Mount Desert Streets, the site of the Grand Central Hotel, where, as I mentioned, Village Green now stands. One of these mentioned that the casino would be home to an orchestra and that Walter Damrosch would help form it and would probably conduct it. By 1900, there were 2 rival schemes in operation. One only progressed so far as the purchase of the site, and they don't tell us where in the report of the Times. The other was finally successful in 1901 when a casino was erected at the corner of Cottage and Bridge Streets. It stood there housing everything from concerts and dances to basketball games and town meetings until it was demolished, to my sorrow, in 1970. Today, the site's a parking lot. Does any of you remember this building?
Yes.
Yeah, Dickie does. Yeah. And Deborah, who put me onto this, said she had played basketball there. There's a couple of pictures upstairs of local dances that I wonder are of the inside of the casino. Is it possible?
Yeah.
Great. I speculated it might be based on what I knew.
Yeah, you can see the balcony overhang if you
Yeah.
look over the people in the picture.
Yeah, there was a kind of dance that was meant to mock the wealthy people. I've forgotten the name of it, but there's 2 photos up there that are of that dance inside the casino. That looks like it was lovely.
Yes.
Sad that it's a parking lot. It opened with a large ball on July the 26th, 1901. This is the report from the New York Times. The July 28th Times briefly reported the event and gave a description of the building. Bar Harbor's new casino, which was opened Friday with a large ball, was begun May last. The building is 55 feet in width by 110 in length and will seat nearly 850 persons. The floor space reserved for dancing is 55 by 70 feet, and the stage is 32 by 55 feet. The walls and ceiling are plastered, and the woodwork has been left in its natural color with a bright finish. There will be entertainments, dances, etc. there nearly every evening. Toward the end of the first season, a lavish benefit concert for the Bar Harbor Hospital was held at the casino. This is a description of it. The vaudeville, a variety show, included a gavotte, a Dutch dance, and various tableaus. One set of tableaus represented Dresden china figures. Another set was called The Passage of Time. Young society ladies presented such figures as Diana, the glory of Byzantine times, and various other representative types from history down to the present day. Summer of 1904 was an especially festive one thanks to the visit of Theodore Roosevelt's elegant and beautiful daughter, Alice. She was a fashionable and attractive 20-year-old. Her father was completing his first term as President of the United States. She should be wearing a blue gown there, if you know the song. My sweet little Alice, blue gown referred to Alice Roosevelt. During her visit, she attended a lavish round of dances, parties, and fetes given in her honor. She also attended a concert of the Bar Harbor Choral Society, which had performed 4 or 5 years before, had first performed 4 or 5 years before. The group performed for many years under the direction of Maurice Rumsey, usually assisted by Walter Damrosch, who probably played the piano. One of the highlights of the 1904 performance was the solo singing of Lillian Blauvelt. Blauvelt was a New York soprano with an international career and a looker, a really beautiful woman. She had sung with Damrosch's orchestra in New York and was 31 years of age at the time of her first Bar Harbor appearance. She made several in the years following. Thanks to the wealth of material stored on the internet, we can get an idea of Blauvelt's singing. So here she is in a recording made just a few years after she first sang in Bar Harbor. This is quite soft, so. So I realized that it's not like ravishingly beautiful, but remember how they were making these recordings. There was a big trumpet, like the one that's in this next room, bigger than that though, and musicians would cluster around it. So, you know, one guy playing a violin, somebody playing a flute, then she'd step up and sing into the thing. And the recording technology just isn't very kind to higher sounds. It tends to roll them off. So the voices of women tend to sound thin in these things. Lower voices did better. I think this is why Caruso was such a hit, because his voice recorded well and sounded more like a natural voice did on those early recordings. During her visit, Ms. Blauvelt was a guest of the Damrosches at Stanwood, the cottage Mrs. Damrosch's father, James G. Blaine, had first taken in 1883. This was just that way on Cleftstone Road, just a little, and if you rummage around there, you can find bits of the foundations there too. At least I could a few years ago. It's still there. Traces of it. Yeah. So sad. Blaine was a noted politician from Maine. He served in the United States House of Representatives and was Speaker of the U.S. House, later a U.S. Senator, and in 1884 he ran for president, losing narrowly to Grover Cleveland. He spent the entire summer of 1884, the campaign year, in Bar Harbor. Can you imagine a presidential candidate doing that now? It's like, oh, I'll just spend the summer in Bar Harbor while I'm running for president. He lost. In 1890, Blaine's daughter Margaret married Walter Damrosch. He was 28 and she was 23. This is obviously a much later photo, actually courtesy of the Damrosch family. From that summer, 1890, until the fire, the Damrosches regularly came to Bar Harbor. Damrosch was, as I've already said, a musical celebrity on a grand scale. Already in the 1890s, he was an important figure in the classical music scene, partly because of his eminent father, Leopold Damrosch, who was director of the Metropolitan Opera from 1883 until his death in 1885. He had also founded the New York Oratorio Society, which still functions, and the New York Symphony Society, which would later merge with the New York Philharmonic Society, and that still functions. By the early 1900s, Leopold's son Walter was a distinguished musician with a significant reputation. Lillian Blauvelt was among the first of a cavalcade of celebrated musicians who came to Bar Harbor and either stayed with the Damrosches or rented cottages on their own and who performed in concerts here. With this influx of great musicians, the casino with its varied program must not have seemed an entirely appropriate place to hold concerts. So the summer people of Bar Harbor pooled their resources to build a concert hall for their own use. Now, hidden underneath that statement is this divide again between various groups of people coming. So the posh people from Boston and New York wanted their own place to go to and have to rub shoulders with the riffraff. Members of the building committee included George Dorr, Mr. Vanderbilt, and Mrs. Robert Abbey. Guy Lowell of Boston, Massachusetts, was the architect. Later, Lowell would design such important buildings as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, there it is, and the New York State Supreme Court building in New York City. He liked Greek and Roman architecture, you can see that. The dedication concert of the Building of Arts was held on July 13th, 1907. It featured Emma Eames, a local girl who had made it big. She was raised in Portland and Bath, and went on to a career singing at the Met, Covent Garden, and the Paris Opera. She's pictured here in the role of Sieglinde in Wagner's Die Walküre, in a photo that's part of the Maine Historical Society collection. This is all available online in the Maine Memory Network, and it's a treasure trove. You can get lost in this for days, and I have. Here's another better photo of her in the same costume. And assisting her on that recital in July of 1907 was her future husband, the baritone Emilia de Gorgorza. Eames had met Gorgorza the year before, in 1906, on a concert tour. Both were married to other people at the time, but it's likely they began a romance that led to two messy divorces. Hers was finalized in April 1907, just a few months before the Bar Harbor concert, but his took 4 years longer. They were eventually married on July the 12th, 1911, but their marriage also ended in divorce. But here they are, in the year of their marriage, in a popular duet. And again, the recording technique seems to favor his voice over hers. Reviews of her singing all talk of the beauty of her voice and her technical accuracy, neither of which seems particularly on display in this recording, but to be fair, she herself wasn't very satisfied with these recordings. This is the swing song from Verdi. singing style is different too. And I've been thinking about the fact, of course, Gogorza was Italian. So his English sounds Italian, you know, all the trill R's and so forth. And I think because of the prominence of European singers, she's doing the same thing, right? We all want to be posh, so we try to sound like Europeans, right? That persists well into the 1940s. And so that's, I think, part of why this sounds so funny to us. We don't do that anymore, thankfully. In the summers following its opening, performances at the Building of Arts were a veritable who's who of American classical music. The summer season of 4 or 5 concerts was regularly announced in the New York Times. Most of the artists who came to the island had a connection to Walter Damrosch. Many were personal friends, and nearly all had a professional connection with him. They had been soloists with his orchestra, had sung in his opera company or with the Oratorio Society, or they had performed solo recitals in New York with Damrosch at the piano. Among those who performed was Albert Spalding. If the name seems familiar, it's because he was a nephew of the famous baseball pitcher and the guy who made baseballs. But as you see, he was a violinist. That's the nephew was a violinist. The pitcher didn't also play the violin. I don't think. I've never heard that anyway. Many of the names of Building of Arts performers are still well known to us today. One of them was the violinist Fritz Kreisler. There's a picture of him in one of the rooms here, who played the Building of Arts several times and stayed with the Damrosches. There he's pictured, he's on the right with his wife, and on the left is Ernest Schelling with his wife and daughter, of course. In 1915, Kreisler came to help another Damrosch friend, the American pianist Ernest Schilling, celebrate his birthday. There's Kreisler. Together they gave a series of 3 recitals of Beethoven sonatas in the Building of Arts. And there's Schelling with the dog again. We have a bit of Schelling's playing from a piano roll he made in 1916. So the technology here is that he's playing a piano and there's a roll being punched as he's doing that. And then what you're hearing is that roll being played on a modern piano with modern recording technique. So yes, it's a recording, but in a sense, it's a live performance by Schelling from 1916 because it captures every nuance of his playing. It's really quite remarkable. So this is a little bit of the Liszt sonata, and I think he makes it sound almost like ragtime. You can tell he's an American pianist. This is Schelling. Here's where it sounds like ragtime to me. Amazing that we have this. And here's a little bit of Fritz Kreisler playing his own composition, Liebeslied, just a few years later, 1930. In subsequent years, the Building of Arts saw a glittering series of seasons featuring such luminaries as the pianist Joseph Hoffman, the harpist Carlos Elzedo, and the Boston-based Kneisel Quartet, Kneisel Hall over on the other side of it. And you told me that the Facebook page for the Historical Society has some of these recordings on it from 2020.
that I just pulled off of YouTube. So many of the performers that he's mentioned, I have a little story about them in a picture. And then I found YouTube recordings of either the actual pieces that they played at the Building of the Arts, because we have their programs, so we know, or a period piece if I couldn't find that. So yes, look for those. It was a series we did in 2020, just a virtual.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All of this was pulled off of YouTube.
Yeah.
YouTube is now a repository of all things musical. You can find almost everything there. It's actually quite fabulous. A lot of it's copyright, but this isn't. It's old enough. But by the 1930s, with the economy suffering, the social and art scene in Bar Harbor began to decline. The war in the 1940s and eventually the fire of 1947 dealt the coup de grace to Bar Harbor's Gilded Age. Even before the Building of Arts was destroyed in the 1947 fire, it had fallen on hard times. In 1943, the building, which had cost about $100,000 to construct in 1907, was sold for $305. It was sold again in 1947 for an amount I can't find to a woman who hoped to open a summer theater there, but the building burned down only 6 months later, and she decided not to reconstruct it. As you know, that part over there by the golf course was really into the intense part of the fire. We're lucky that this bit escaped. And there's a map upstairs you can see that shows the extent of the fire. This little wedge of Bar Harbor somehow manages to be spared. I wonder if it's because of the paving. Because of the pavement. Because the wind direction, you think?
Yeah, the wind shifted. Yeah.
Okay.
And we're kind of on a point here, plus the guzzle, the little water next to us acted as a fire barrier. So it basically burned right down toward the schooner head, and Bar Harbor survived.
And a lot of it burned underground for a while, didn't it?
Yeah, and the peat moss, where it started out near Dolliver's Dump. That's right, for days. I mean, the fire lasted 30 days. So they keep coming up. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. I don't think we really fully understand the extent to which that really is a point of demarcation in the history of this place. Because anybody who was still coming stopped coming at that point. The Damrosch is among them. Stanwood was among the places destroyed. It was right there in that hot spot there. And many of their personal effects were lost along with their important memorabilia. And I guess that this was so depressing to them that they never really recovered from the shock. Mrs. Damrosch died just 2 years later in 1949, and Dr. Damrosch the next year in 1950. And the family do say that the loss of this home and everything in it was really devastating for them. Nevertheless, the musical culture that they had helped to create lived beyond them. The center of gravity shifted away from Bar Harbor for a time, but Seal Harbor, Northeast Harbor, not coincidentally, they've been spared by the fire, right? And even Long Pond continued as a favorite summer retreat for celebrated musicians and academics. By the 1960s, Mount Desert was undergoing a sort of renaissance, and the island's cultural vitality resurfaced in the form of such organizations as the Mount Desert Festival of Chamber Music, the Bar Harbor Festival, and the Mount Desert Summer Chorale, all founded between 1965 and 1968, two of them in Northeast Harbor. Several factors combined to make Bar Harbor an important stop for world-renowned classical musicians. First, the place was and is beautiful, and that is always at the core of what happens here. Second, it became a haven for wealthy people who could both afford culture and who expected to find it. When they couldn't, they could be relied on to organize and fund it themselves. But most important of all, I think, was the presence of Walter Damrosch, a musician of considerable ability with powerful connections throughout the international music world. He could bring his musical friends here to stay in his very spacious mansion, and his society friends could pay their fees and would patronize their concerts. It was a perfect combination. Damrosch's contributions to the musical life of Bar Harbor have had lasting effects that we still feel today in the groups and organizations that have carried on in his legacy, my own Mount Desert Summer Chorale, I modestly say, among them. His musical activity here was part of the way he realized the creed immortalized on his tombstone. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, I have done, at the bottom there, I have done my utmost to spread the joys that music can bring to men. We owe him and the many who preceded him a debt of gratitude for the enduring legacy of great music on Mount Desert Island. And we have a few minutes, I think, for some questions or comments or conversation about this. I did get to walk around here. There's some fabulous things connected to this story. There's a picture of Walter Damrosch upstairs. There's a picture of the Blaine family, including Margaret Damrosch. Not many photos of her, so that's actually rare. Schelling's pictures upstairs. This piano was paid by Paderewski. So, and of course there are pianos and harmoniums in many of the rooms, so you get a sense of that same thing that I'm talking about here.
I have a question. Going back to the Wabanaki music that you have, I've heard music like that before, but what I've never seen, do they ever translate the words? Are they translatable?
Yes, but I think that because this is highly ritual music and they're trying to preserve its ritual character, it's hard to find a lot of information about this music. In other words,
Are there words? I mean,
yeah, they're saying words, and the text is something about turtles and women being powerful like turtles and enduring. It's the best I could find for that particular piece.
A lot of the singing is vocables, so it's not literal words too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's important to note, especially because we're about to perform the Mozart Requiem, Europeans are less concerned about taking music from a ritual setting and putting it in a non-ritual setting. This doesn't bother us at all, and in fact, we think it's the normal thing to have happen. But there are a lot of cultures that resist that feel that that's a profanation of music to take it out of its ritualistic context. And my experience with Native American music is that most Native cultures are very wary about letting white people take over the music. Because what tends to happen is the original musicians get erased. Another subject for another whole lecture, because I've done that, but the Negro spiritual is a perfect example. Everybody sings them now, and we kind of forget about the people who first sang them. So there's a lot of caution about that. So it's hard to find, for somebody from outside like me, it's hard to find a lot of detailed information about the music.
Interesting question. Interesting to me that Damrosch, I guess, is buried on the island.
Yes, just a short distance away.
Right. So not that long ago, relatively speaking. So his family, was that his wish to be buried here?
I believe so.
As opposed to New York or wherever his quote home was?
Yep, both of them.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I suspect some of you can relate to this. I know I can. My family's been coming here since the year 2000. And we've lived in a couple of different houses elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But we've always come here. And in many ways, this feels like home, even though we only spend a few weeks in the summer here.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the time we spend hoping we can get back. And I think that's how they felt. The atmosphere of what was going on there at their home and the musical life he developed here, I think they really felt like this was a kind of home for them. So yes, there are descendants of the Damrosches that still come here every summer. They have a place on Long Pond. Yeah.
The second question.
Sure.
Where did church music kind of intersect or not? Or did it have any kind of influence on?
Well, that's what the singing schools were about to begin with. I probably wasn't clear enough about that. But what they were trying to do was improve hymn singing. That's what they were trying to do. And also to develop groups that would sing something during church services. Mm-hmm. The way we think of church choirs today is actually a relatively recent phenomenon, with professional singers involved, maybe with amateur singers and that kind of thing. That's actually an outgrowth of the Westminster School, which started in Ohio and then went to New Jersey. And it was their idea, the people who founded that school, John Finley Williamson among others, to professionalize church music in the United States. So that's a progress that starts in the 18th century and goes on really to the present day. Yeah.
Have you found any documentation of music during the suffrage movement on Mount Desert Island or during the Prohibitionist movement?
You know, I didn't look specifically for that because I got so fascinated by the building of arts that I didn't look for those social movement things. Mm-hmm. There probably was some. I don't know what role, be interesting to find out, wouldn't it? Yeah. The women who came here would have played in the suffrage movement. Because there was a certain culture, right? Mm-hmm. Dad's at home in his office in Boston or New York, right? And Mom comes up here with the kids, and Dad maybe comes up on the weekends or something to escape the heat of the city. But these society women were running a certain kind of culture. I wonder how much they would have, it's always an interesting subject, you know? How much do you bite the hand that feeds you in a sense, right? Yeah, it's a complicated question. Yes?
What do you feel the impacts of the vaudeville theaters like the Criterion and the Star Theater during the rise in the 30s would have had on places like the Casino and the Building of the Arts?
Well, and that's part of the tension, isn't it? Is that there's another whole musical scene that I haven't talked about, which is sort of the folk music and popular music scene. Let's not also forget, since you mentioned the Criterion, people making music in movie theaters. That was big business. There's a reason why George Eastman, who helped invent the Kodak camera, wanted to have a music school, because he was involved in movies, and he wanted people who could. Howard Hanson persuaded him, George, you got all these movie theaters and the music's awful. Train some musicians. That's where the Eastman School got founded. There's a couple of pictures upstairs of some women playing organs in a couple of different theaters. So yes, again, it would probably mostly have been in the summer, because that's when the largest number of people would be here. But my understanding is the Casino kind of went all year round with various kinds of things, from dances to sporting events to town meetings, and surely there were, I don't like to use the term high, low, middle brow, but more popular kinds of concerts happening there. The other thing about the Casino versus the Building of Arts. The Building of Arts is another part of a little bit unseemly history, where summer people were building facilities for their use that the year-round residents were not allowed to use. So it was not available for use in the winter by the year-round residents. They had to use the Casino. That's a shame, really. It was also true of, for instance, St. Mary's by the Sea down in Northeast. They built a beautiful stone church, but it was only available in the summer to the summer people. Hence, 2 churches for that congregation.
How did they keep the people out? Were there just high ticket prices, or they truly could not buy a ticket if they...
Well, they certainly could have bought a ticket to one of the events in the summer if they could have afforded it, right? Or you do it by subscription is another way. But what I mean is that in October, the people from the town couldn't say, oh, we want to put on something in the Casino. It was in the Building of Arts. The staff wasn't there. There was nobody to do it. So I imagine they weren't overt and saying, no, you're not permitted to use it. They just made it so it couldn't be used. Yes?
When I was in college and coming up summers, I would hear about Leopold Stokowski in Seal Harbor. And I was wondering if you came across any information, or if he had a salon or guests like Walter Damrosch.
He did. And in fact, so actually one of the things about this presentation, if I showed you the actual presentation, there's about as many photographs in it that are hidden as you see. And one of them that I have is a group with Stravinsky and Stokowski and a couple of other people there in Seal Harbor. So yes, that was what would happen, is somebody like that would come and say to his pals, why don't you come and play in Bar Harbor or Seal Harbor or wherever. Frankly, I do the same thing. I've been able to get some of my friends to come for way less than their normal fees because it's pretty here. And they'll also be nice to do me a favor. So, my colleagues from ASU, notably Gordon Hawkins, who sings at the Kennedy Center with the Washington National Opera in Seattle, came here and was our Elijah for a fraction of what he would normally get to do that. And I'm pretty sure that's what was probably happening in the early 20th century too. One of Stokowski's pals would come and give a concert while they're here. Why not?
There was a conductor, Nagarati. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but his wife was around for quite a few years after, and she would refer to him as Maestro.
Yes.
So I don't know who he is, but maybe others do.
The name's familiar. I can't tell you anything about him right off the bat, but I've certainly heard the name. Yeah.
And back, I don't know if it was the 80s or 90s now, in Bar Harbor there was something called the Unusual Cabaret. Does anybody remember that? It was where Cafe This Way is now.
Yeah.
And I think it happened once every 2 weeks or something. And all the musicians would get together and act. It was all different kinds of things. and you would really have quite an amazing night of entertainment. And I'll always remember that as a highlight, of summer life here. That particular place, it just lasted 2 or 3 years at the most.
I think an important piece of the culture here that maybe we don't think about enough is those academics coming in the first part of the 20th century, and then eventually founding places like the Jackson Laboratory and the MDI Biological Laboratory. So you have a constant influx of intelligentsia coming here. And they want stuff going on. And their kids are going to school here and are brilliant. I meant to mention, so I will now, the high school choir for MDI High School wins the show choir contest every single year. They've won it for something like 9 or 10 years in a row. From Little Mount Desert, right? That has, a population of 10,000 year-round. So the thing that strikes me about this island is, despite its small geographic size and its small population, it has this outsized arts scene, musical scene especially, of all kinds: folk music, popular music, and classical music, and even, of course, Native American music. It's quite remarkable for such a small place. And I think, until we get to know it, we get a little bit surprised by that, because, we're all snobs, us musicians, and think, well, with a tiny place like that, what could be really going on? It's fantastic, though. We can put together an orchestra for the summer chorale of 25 or 30 people, all professional musicians from either the area, or again, people coming up from New York who are spending a few weeks here to play concerts. It's in a sense, it's the same thing that was going on 100 years ago. Well, thank you. I want to give a few acknowledgments here. There were, as I mentioned along the way, the Maine Historical Society, the MDI Historical Society, Tina Hawes at the library, I don't know if she still works there, Bar Harbor Historical Society. Deborah was a huge help when I first did this. David and Walter Damrosch gave me that picture of their grandmother. And especially thanks to you for having me here. And then here's the shameless plug. The concert is August the 6th in the Criterion, which is air-conditioned. We make a big fuss of that because the last 2 concerts we gave, people fainted in St. Xavier's from the heat and climate change. So there's just 1 concert this year because that's a big place. And we're doing the Mozart Requiem, as you kindly mentioned. So please think about coming to that. It's going to be quite splendid. The Criterion's a wonderful place to play. We discovered that last summer. It's a really beautiful place to play and sing, so it should be quite lovely. And we're working hard to make it great. So please do come if you can. So thank you very much. I think that and I won't run off if you have other questions.
Thank you very much, and give us a moment. We'll pull up the screen, and please join us for some refreshments.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Wait till you see this. I mean, that's just like a picture, isn't it?
And Jamie is here to serve you. So just watch your step here.
Go ahead and unplug that. Oh, I wouldn't miss it.
No. Well, that's interesting because I thought we were related to anyone with that last name, so I know.
Yes.
Born 6, 7 generations. This is one of the great-great-grandfather was actually he was full-blooded Chinese. He was a stowaway on a ship in 1957 sailed from Amoy, China, to Southwest Harbor. And his last name was K-A-U. That's how we got
Chase music, there's a whole section of that.
because the worst everyone knows
But you can imagine that if the music wasn't very good,
so that was 1857.
to someone like George.
Yeah, we have a.
And so it's really true. That's how it is.
I could go anywhere and look up the name Crawford in the phone book and call.
When I first came in,
Oh, I know.
it was the house that
They're
had
just so
three
cool,
songs.
because it's an unusual.
And when I came
Yeah,
back,
yeah.
we considered
What's the Gloria Cloud?
the
Gloria
summer
Chuck
chorale.
Cloud.
In 1999,
They're
it just
CLA.
not
Yeah, so
happening.
that's why I asked that.
But I've been in that house, and let me tell you, that is
visiting?
so sound.
We're